Okay, well, welcome. Good evening. This webinar is Laudato Deum, a Canadian discussion. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement and an opening reflection. So the movement, Laudato Si Movement Canada, with faith in the common good, acknowledges that our projects from coast to coast to coast are on traditional territories of diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We seek to live in respect, peace, and right relations, and are mindful of broken covenants. By making a land acknowledgement, we are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous heritage, which dates back over 10,000 years. And I invite each of you to think of the land, the location, and the peoples that were and are still there with you, that have been stewards of what we know today as Canada for many, many centuries. So the prayer reflection that I'll be sharing has been very recently developed by the Laudato Si movement. It is the Laudate Deum Examine. It is a tool for prayer, reflection, and action for individuals and communities to deepen the call to care for creation and the most vulnerable. This evening, we'll reflect on 2 of the 5 steps of the examine. So step number 2 is ask God for light. It begins with a quote from Laudate Deum, paragraph number 61. I cannot fail in this regard to remind the Catholic faithful of the motivations born of their faith. Authentic faith not only gives strength to the human heart, but also transforms life, transfigures our goals, and sheds light on our relationship to others and with creation as a whole. We reflect upon the presence of God throughout our day, as well as where we have turned away from harmonious relationships with God, the most vulnerable of our neighbors, and all of creation. Let us ask God to illuminate our days and actions with lucidity and honesty. Now, give a minute or 2 for us to think about that quietly on our own. And now I'm going to read step 5 of the Laudate Deum examine. And it is entitled, Look Toward the Day to Come. Pope Francis asks us to reflect upon some big questions. He says, in conscience and with an eye to the children who will pay for the harm done by their actions and our actions, the question of meaning inevitably arises. What is the meaning of my life? What is the meaning of my time on this earth? What is the ultimate meaning of all my work and effort? These big questions are answered through the choices we make day by day. Pope Francis says, this is the path. Goodness together with love, justice, and solidarity are not achieved once and for all. They have to be realized each day, in every moment, and in every action. At the end of our webinar this evening, there's a few more questions that follow up that 5th piece of the reflection, and I'll use those for us to think about as we close off our meeting. So tonight, we have 3 speakers. I am one of them. Each of us will present for 10 minutes. And then between the 3 discussion partners, we'll have 10 minutes to respond to each other. And following that, we'll have a question and answer session with all the participants. So you can either raise your hand, and I'll ask Anna to keep an eye on that when it comes time for questions, or put your questions in, let's see, in the chat box, and we'll try and capture them that way. So I mentioned Anna Johnson. She is sort of working behind the scenes today, but is very much in front of the scenes most of the time, and very thankful to have her here with us. She's managing the Zoom platform we're on tonight. And as you saw, as you came in, we're recording this event, and she's capturing that for us. I'm going to introduce the other two speakers. Chris Hrynkow will speak first. He has a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Manitoba, and he is a doctorate of theology and Christian ecological ethics from the University of Toronto. He is also an associate professor in religion and culture at St. Thomas More College, the University of Saskatchewan. And there he teaches courses in religious studies, Catholic studies, peace studies, and critical perspectives on social justice and the common good. He's also serving as the initial director of the Center for Faith, Reason, and Justice at the college, and is department head and undergraduate chair of religion and culture for the University of Saskatchewan. Genevieve Gallant has over 25 years of experience in public engagements and advocacy on human rights, ecological justice, and the structures that fuel global inequalities. She has worked with Development at Peace, Caritas Canada, Citizens for Public Justice, Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle, and Kairos. As the executive director of the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology, which is her current position, she's working with 23 religious congregations to increase Catholic impact on federal policy change for social and ecological justice. And I am the third presenter who will present actually in the middle between the other two. And I am the national coordinator of the Laudato Si Movement in Canada. So at this point, I will turn it over to Chris for his presentation.
Thanks, Agnes. Really a pleasure to be here. So what I was asked to do today is sort of give a general overview and reflection and ground it in my context. And I've written out a script. So as Rosemary and some other people on this call will know, if I don't have a script, I will take the whole time, which would not be right. So Laudato Deum starts with an eco-spiritual statement about worldview, drawing upon the examples of St. Francis of Assisi, the Psalms, and Jesus. And that's done in order to show the value of all things. This is a feature of Francis's opening because it signals that this attitude, one of integral ecology, that we're supposed to take into what follows. Or we can say, providing faith-inspired reasons to take the opportunities that Francis asserts are provided by crises like the COVID-19 pandemic and respond to the main focus of his latest apostolic exhortation, that which we're considering this evening, and that focus is human-caused climate change. It is necessary for Francis to write on these issues in a focused way because it has been 8 years since he released his watershed encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. Yet the wicked problems he identified within that encyclical have only worsened. Francis shows us in Laudato Deum that this growing malaise is problematic for not only Catholics, for whom Laudato Si ought to be binding upon their conscience, but also to people of goodwill everywhere who are addressed in the present apostolic exhortation, and the audience of all people, whether they have goodwill or not, who are named in Laudato Si. In Laudate Deum, Francis names several of the socio-ecological challenges facing the Earth community and gives scientific, political, and spiritual diagnoses concerning how to respond to them authentically. For my remaining time, I will unfold a few of these examples that strike me and resonate with my context of responsibilities living and working on Treaty 6 territory in the province of Saskatchewan. The first one that jumps out at me is this rather tired argument that I've heard a few times this week as our weather turned. We got snow for the first time, and we reconnected our neurons to the bone-chilling cold that characterizes our prairies. This argument is captured in the flippant remark, "So much for global warming." Such remarks, as Francis points out, are a means to ridicule those who are concerned about climate change. Yet Francis shows that climate change is real, with much evidence, and helps us to see what is really obscured when we allow such thin arguments to unduly influence our imagination. He continues that these arguments serve to make nature a mere backdrop at humanity's disposal. However, our location in the natural world matters. There's something about being on the prairies and embracing the right to be cold that makes us who we are. That reminds us of our vulnerabilities and the connected power of nature, to see its beauty in the tiny elements in the mode of Jesus, Francis, and the Psalms. That is to witness the beauty in the prairie grass in a way that is important but different than the experience in the Rocky Mountains or of Niagara Falls or of the waves at Tofino or of a sunrise on the east coast of Mi'kma'ki. As Francis teaches, all these styles of experience are of great importance. And indeed, as he emphasizes in Laudato Deum, our human experience would be incomprehensible and meaningless without nature. We need to remember that insight. That is to join ourselves back on the level of our sociological imagination with the world. For us to be authentically human, that is absolutely necessary. Here on the prairies, environmental historians are looking at how the landscape and the cold helps us. Does so from little things like killing pests that threaten prairie ecosystems to engendering the insights that show us in the need for solidarity of the sort that brought us the recognized need for co-ops and for Medicare. This is a space here on the prairies in a region the Canadians sometimes call the Gap, a place to pass over or through on the way to somewhere else. This is also something that Saskatchewanians who live in the prairies sometimes internalize, failing to acknowledge the biological and spiritual significance of the territories within which we live. In contrast, Francis calls us for a deeper solidarity in Laudato Deum. That is a solidarity that, in line with the best of the Medicare and co-op movements, integrates concern and care for those on the margins. That is concern and care for those who have contributed the least to the present socio-ecological malaise, but those who bear its greatest costs. Francis, drawing on the teaching of the African bishops, further demonstrates how this marginalization, a recurring phenomenon felt in multiple ways in the bodies of my fellow treaty people who are Indigenous on this territory, is bolstered by what he and the bishops call structural sin. This structural sin, based in the way we organize our society, is itself buttressed by weak politics on these socio-ecological issues of the style associated with our highly conservative Sask party, which has formed the provincial government since 2007 and has tried at virtually every turn to block the pluralism, the courage, and the subsidiarity that Francis teaches is required by politicians. Francis also allows us to see his title for the apostolic exhortation points back to how an arrogance and hubris that take God's rightful place pervades such politics. Moreover, in a point that I think closes my brief introduction well, he names an important role for heartfelt religion on the level of transfiguration to animate the necessary moral movement, a moral movement that is not only personal, but also political, towards ways of being that transform our relationships with other human beings and with the rest of creation. In sum, Laudato Deum provides another set of paths of dialogue and action for animating the incarnation of such integral and transformed human earth divine relationships. It sets this up as a major task before us so that we can journey together into a vital and verdant future.
Thank you so much, Chris. You've brought both the international aspect of what Pope Francis is telling us in Laudato Deum and made it very personal and local to where you are, which is also what Pope Francis asks us to do, to live in our place and use our knowledge of our place to protect and care for the common good. So I'm going to begin by reading a portion of the Laudato Si Movement statement to Canada's negotiators to COP28 in light of Laudato Deum. The statement was prepared by Anna Johnson, who is with us tonight. She is the Laudato Si Movement Senior Programs Manager for North America, and Joe Gunn, a member of the Canadian Laudato Si Movement Chapter's Advisory Circle. It was delivered this morning to Canada's Chief Negotiator, Climate Ambassador Catherine Stewart. And the statement says, as the country of Canada burned through fires raging across the country this summer, and the world suffered extreme impacts of climate change in every region, we, the Laudato Si Movement, encourage Canada to consider the common good and the future of our children more than short-term interests in making and implementing urgent and bold commitments to respond to the climate crisis. Canada has made profound steps forward to achieve real progress in the ecological crisis. We applaud those important steps forward. But Canada continues to have an outsized impact on the climate crisis, particularly through regulations and policies around deforestation, mining, and fossil fuel extraction, both within and beyond Canada. Canadian companies continue to write more chapters in a history of colonialism through further fossil fuel and mineral exploration and extraction, harming the climate, ecosystems, and communities. Instead, we must seek a healthy ecology, which is also the result of interaction between human beings and the environment, as occurs in the Indigenous cultures and has occurred for centuries in different regions of the earth. In concert with Catholic communities across the country, we ask Canada's government to commit to the following, moving in the haste necessary to recognize adequately that we are in a climate emergency. The first of our asks is that Canada increase our greenhouse gas emissions target from that earlier set as reducing emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030 to 60% below 2005 levels in the same time frame. Rather than decreasing, emissions from Canada's oil and gas industry continue to grow, proving Pope Francis's statement in Laudato Deum true here in Canada. The necessary transition towards clean energy sources such as wind and solar and the abandonment of fossil fuels is not progressing at the necessary speed. Canada's climate ambition must be increased, and it must stop all exploratory drilling and extraction with a fair phase out and a just transition. The second ask in the statement is that Canada increase global support for climate adaptation from 40% of its current international climate finance commitment to at least 50% in line with the Paris Agreement. The third ask is that Canada commit new and extensive public funds to meet Canada's just share of responsibilities for loss and damage in the global south. Natural resources have become a form of control over foreign debt. The climate crisis calls on the international community to rethink inequity. True ecological debt must come to light between global north and the global south, connected to the environmental impact of commercial imbalances and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. We all need to have the chance to be architects of our own future. So that is the statement that was delivered this morning, in fact, to Climate Change Ambassador Catherine Stewart. The Laudato Si Movement in Canada has promoted 2 or 3 actions that I'd like to tell you about, but in advance of that, I want to lay out a little bit of groundwork along with this statement. So Laudato Deum was written out of urgency because despite the many negotiations and agreements, global emissions continue to rise. As I mentioned, this morning, I attended a conversation between young women connected to the Laudato Si movement from around the world with Canada's chief climate ambassador to COP28. The representatives were from Canada, Ecuador, France, Namibia, Panama, the Navajo Nation in America, and others. We heard over and over again that extraction companies with headquarters in Canada are committing grave human and ecological abuses. They operate without concern for the people and lands in which they extract oil, gas, gold, copper, lithium, and many other minerals. As Ina Marie Chikongo stated, it is time to make polluters pay. In negotiations, Canada must think about what companies are doing around the world and strengthen the policies that are currently too weak to prevent human rights abuses and ecocide. As the Laudato Si statement says, in Canada, we must press for a cessation of public subsidies in whatever form they take to the coal, oil, and gas industry here and abroad. The industry needs to be held accountable for environmental destruction in domestic instances, like the tailing ponds leaking into the Athabasca River, and similar instances that happen abroad. When a question was posed about a perceived imbalance of power that Canada brings to the United Nations climate negotiations, and as an example, COP27 saw a very high number of oil and gas industry executives whose presence significantly outnumbered all other groups, youth, Indigenous, civil society, women, and others. The ambassador said these delegates were there to listen and hear voices like those of the women who attended this morning's meeting. But we should also ask, to what end are the oil executives and their representatives there in these international negotiations? Do they listen with the intent of finding placatory language that allows them to continue their destructive business models unimpeded by regulations? Or do they listen to make changes in their industry that address the concerns of every human impacted by their company's work? Are they hindering processes needed to reverse expansion of fossil fuels? Or are they helping with their huge profits to transition to cleaner forms of energy and restoring to health those poisoned waters and lands and people displaced by climate disasters? MLSM Canada proposes 3 powerful actions. The first is to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as individuals, and then also to seek opportunities to bring organizations rooted in spirituality on board: Catholic schools and school boards, post-secondary institutions, retreat centers, social justice communities committees like Catholic Women's League, St. Vincent de Paul, Development and Peace, and Catholic healthcare institutions. Our second suggestion is the initiation of a letter writing campaign to Canadian bishops. In the 8 years since the release of Laudato Si, Pope Francis has spoken often of the need to move finances away from polluting fossil fuels in favor of renewable sources of energy. The letter writing campaign to Canadian bishops asks for divestment from the fossil fuels of their personal pensions and diocesan financial assets. Our letters intend to encourage bishops to make a bold ethical stand for the health of humanity and the planet over short-term financial gains. Financial investments should not allow destruction of human lives and ecosystems by financially supporting fossil fuel companies. In Laudato Deum, Pope Francis writes, "We must move beyond the mentality of appearing to be concerned, but not having the courage to produce substantial changes." By writing letters to our bishops, we are asking them to lead by example and courageously raise their voices to the economic and political halls of power, and thereby enabling the voices of grassroots movements like ours to gain credibility and a degree of respect that is deserved. Finally, I encourage faith leaders, communities, and individuals to learn about the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. It is a coalition of leaders who have come together to act on the recommendations laid out in the Indigenous Circle of Experts landmark report, We Rise Together, for creating and expanding Indigenous protected and conserved areas in the spirit of reconciliation. You might notice that Anna is posting some links in the chat box as I'm speaking. So these are things that will be captured, but you can also, at your leisure, click on them and read them in more detail later. Learning about and engaging with partnerships like the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership presents us with healing opportunities for our relationships with the earth and with each other. And to be honest, we should not be attempting to find economic and political solutions unless we also understand the concerns and leadership offered by Indigenous communities in our own country. Thank you. And now I will pass over to Genevieve for her comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Agnes. So I was asked to speak a bit about how Laudato Deum is applicable in the Canadian context, particularly with public policy. So I'll tell you right from the bat, with the Laudato Deum, I expected there would be more about women, about the synod, about migrants, or about war. But then I would say climate change used to be one of many social justice issues that we worked on. I worked in international development, on issues with migrants and refugees, Indigenous justice. We have social justice issues like homelessness and the working poor, water access, security, peace, natural disasters. But really, where we're at right now is there only one lens. That one lens is the climate emergency, and Laudato Deum is Pope Francis's State of the Union on this emergency. When Pope Francis clarified after the publication of Laudato Si that his was not a green encyclical, but a social encyclical, he made a point about us being transformed by our care for creation. He said, we cannot say that mankind is here and creation, the environment is there. Ecology is total, it's human. This is what I sought to express in the encyclical Laudato Si. Man cannot be separated from the rest. There is a relationship which is reciprocally influential, both the environment on the person and the person in a way that affects the environment. And the effect bounces back to man when the environment is mistreated. For in society, in the social life of mankind, we cannot forget to take care of the environment. Moreover, looking after the environment is a social attitude which socializes us in one sense or another. And on the other hand, it enables us to welcome creation, what we are given as a gift. So in Laudato Deum, he is reminding us of this. How is it going with that gift? Are we being socialized? Have we been changed by a renewed relationship with creation? Is our society changing? So now I'm going to channel a bit of what I call my grumpy grandfather, Pope Francis, for the next 8 minutes. Like when he says in Laudato Deum, once and for all, let us put an end to the irresponsible derision that would present this issue as something purely ecological, green, romantic, frequently subject to ridicule by economic interests. Let us finally admit that it is a human and social problem on any number of levels. For this reason, it calls for involvement on the part of all. In conferences on the climate, the actions of groups negatively portrayed as radicalized tends to attract attention. But in reality, they are filling a space that is left empty by society as a whole, which ought to exercise a healthy pressure, since every family ought to realize that the future of their children is at stake. So Laudato Deum is laying this out. We are approaching the point of no return. And who needs to hear this? This encyclical is written for folks who have been making excuses. Businesses, governments, climate deniers, yes, and everybody that's participating in our dirty, rotten, industrial capitalist system. I love the language in Pope Francis's encyclicals. Here he talks about the unchecked human intervention, about homicidal pragmatism, reminding us that we're behaving as though human beings have no limits. He quotes the African bishops. Everybody loves this. When he says, clear climate change makes manifest a tragic and striking example of structural sin. And how about this technocratic paradigm? This idea that technological and economic growth is what equals goodness and truth. Let's remember that the driver of climate change is not humanity in general, but those who have most benefited from massive economic development around the world and across national borders, what I call the 11%, the 1%, but also the 10% of which we are part. And we need regulation, we need legislation, and we need limits. Do we trust what we've created? Do I trust my bank down the street to divest? Do I trust my pension to be invested in fruitful, humane projects? Do I trust there will be a pension plan for me when I retire? Do I trust that the COP28 meetings, do I trust those meetings in the United Arab Emirates? Do I trust those will be fruitful? Pope Francis is talking about the free market capitalist patriarchal system that is in collapse. Globalization as it looks today is not what we want to build. We have politicians that are more focused on the election cycle than the need to do the next right thing. And this is a real challenge. We need to make changes because this is an absolute emergency and because we believe there's a better way. I love what's happening in Ontario. This has been massive turnaround around the Greenbelt. Everybody was totally depressed about what was happening. We were gobsmacked that you had an elected leader who campaigned on leaving the Greenbelt alone, then just straight up sell it to developers. But he had to walk that back and flip that around. So that's a limit, a real limit that people said, no, that's not okay. And people made the change. So this is actually a massive victory for the grassroots, and it's still being played out. So I want to really emphasize that we don't get enough time to talk about when things really work, but pulling this back and protecting land in the Greenbelt, that's a big one. And this is important because on a national level in Canada, we've committed to conserving 30% of Canada's lands and oceans by 2030. 30 by 30 sounds excellent. Talk to people about this. They're like 30% of Canada, no problem. But the real commitment isn't just to protect 30%. 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial, inland water, and marine and coastal ecosystems, putting 30% of those areas under effective restoration to enhance biodiversity and ecological integrity and connectivity. So where are these areas that have been degraded that we need to kind of reclaim and restore? Well, it's where we live. And if we talk about 30% of Canada is Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta combined. So that's what we've committed to protect and restore by 2030, 7 years from now. And I'm excited about this, especially when you think of the biodiversity we have in Canada. So imagine if we protected 30% of every diverse type of biodiversity we have in Canada. And Laudato Si Deum, it reminds us that it's up to us. And that we have to choose if we're going to let the developers decide or whether we're going to decide. So this is how we're being socialized by our relationship with creation to see this interconnectedness. And what we need in Integral Ecology is to bring together campaigns that target concurrent issues so that we can look at housing affordability, poverty and inequality, and the climate crisis with a climate crisis lens. Are we going to leave the climate crisis to the winners of capitalism to resolve? Are we going to leave the system to them? Are we going to let the fossil fuel companies decide? No, an integral ecology lens aims to change these big systems so they work for everyone. And that's why Pope Francis talks about multilateralism from below. A globalization with spontaneous cultural interchanges, greater mutual knowledge, and processes of integration of peoples to provoke a multilateralism from below, and not simply one determined by the elites of power. The demands that rise up from below throughout the world, where activists from very different countries help and support each other, can end up pressuring the sources of power. This is right from Laudato Deum. It is to be hoped that this will happen with respect to the climate crisis. For this reason, I reiterate, Pope Francis reiterates that unless citizens control political power, national, regional, and municipal, it will not be possible to control damage to the environment. So strengthening democracy is now climate action. What are the campaigns, the organizations, the groups, the churches, the faith communities that we can support that are putting life before profit? You have in the links, a divestment letter to write to your bishop. If you're in a community where it's harder to talk about divestment, start the discussion. Do a little research yourself of how you can divest. We have the contributions that I've contributed to parish life, my whole life. That's the money, our money that we want to make sure is divested. It's time also for us to put our elected leaders' feet to the fire, like with Doug Ford and the Greenbelt in Ontario. And let's get really excited about 30 for 30. This November 4th, there's going to be Power Up protests. And what the date was chosen because that's when the large banks' quarterly profits will be released. And this is Pope Francis's question. To the powerful, I can only repeat this question. What would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so? These are the moments to lay bare the moral bankruptcy in our capitalist system. Today, climate action is being an ally to Indigenous people. It's time for us to focus on the common good economy. Land back is climate action. We need to be allies to creation. We need to listen to female economists. We need to stand as citizens, taking action because it is urgent and necessary to do so. And to this, Pope Francis is asking us, what are we waiting for?
Genevieve, thank you very much. That was wonderful. It was both inspiring. It was a call to action, and I have to say, I love grumpy Pope Francis. So we have 10 minutes now to share amongst us anything that stood out or any expansion of what we heard. So maybe I can ask Chris again if he could comment on anything that he heard from myself or Genevieve, and then we'll get things bouncing back and forth a little bit.
Sure. So I think both of you did a very good job of grounding this stuff in practical action, and that's part of what we're called to do and called to do by Pope Francis. So in my whatever life as an ecological ethicist, several of the ideas that you mentioned, I think, are worth like unpacking a little bit, and I think both of you unpacked elements of also what I was saying. So I think it's a really good conversation. It's almost like we need a little weaving together. So I'll try to do that a little bit. This idea that you referenced from the letter, Agnes, of ecological debt, I think that's a really important concept that's from Laudato Si, the original encyclical. And it asks us to reflect upon sort of the deservedness of the current structural system in the world, how it relates to distribution of wealth, power, cultural prestige, etc., both within nations and particularly within the international system. And we can see in basic terms how lots of countries who benefited from colonialism stole something, and then they owe something to people who are on the margins, both amongst the community of nations and within nations. So that's a very powerful concept that Pope Francis brought in to Catholic social teaching. And there's lots to unpack there, and there's lots of duties, ethical duties that flow from that. I like this idea that Genevieve talked about in terms of creation being a gift. And we often think, and maybe this is a problem, with Western culture, that when we get a gift, once we receive that gift, it's ours to do with, dispose of as we like. But if you start to think about the idea of what a gift is, both philosophically in Western philosophical traditions, but particularly talk to Indigenous folks about what gift giving represents, a gift is never this free gift. It's never a gift on the level of grace, although we use that language to talk about grace. It's on a level that's much more spiritual, intertwined, connecting. A gift is about entering into relationships. It's about entering into responsibilities. And gift giving is something intimate, personal. So if creation is a gift and we unpack that, it engenders kind of all these responsibilities that we have. And I really liked a lot of the phrases that Genevieve brought up. I've written down a couple of them. Of course, what Agnes highlighted about grumpy Pope Francis. I don't think that's necessarily grumpy. I think that's speaking, using a power that you've been given, a position of privilege that you've been given, to speak in a prophetic manner. And that's something that's very refreshing and important coming from a papacy. And it wasn't absent in other papacies, but they're in a special way on the socio-ecological level in Francis, because of what Genevieve is identifying, this connection where you cannot separate ecology in some sort of romantic way, so that it's separate from peace. It's separate from social justice. It's separate from cooperative principles. It's separate from the type of ideas that drive Medicare. I think that's very important for a context like mine that's a fossil fuel exploitive economy. We're not trying to put the loggers over the spotted owls. Those folks are all in relationship with each other. And I guess the last thing I'll say, there's much more I'd like to say, but I think that this goal that Francis is setting and is very clear here in Laudato Deum and is in Laudato Si as well, is he asks people to think through that process of what it means to be a politician, to have power, and the personal changes are not enough. They're important. They're virtue building, and that's significant from Catholic traditions. But we need those structural changes. We need to address that structural change, and that's the realm of this politics that we've identified with various terms tonight: pluralistic from the grassroots, courageous, and really questioning like politicians and other faith leaders, etc., to think about their legacy and to think about it not in terms of holding on to power, but leaving something substantive that allows for this sort of social and ecological flourishing together. And that's what we need to move forward. So those are some of the things that struck me. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is very helpful. I'd like to give Genevieve a chance to respond. My responses are more generalized, and I'll keep them to the end if there's time. Yeah.
I would just say thank you very much to Chris for actually kind of really bring almost the spirit of place of Saskatchewan in the way you talk about ecological justice. And I literally could see Saskatchewan in my mind and the valleys and the fruitfulness. And that's, I think, about this, to be socialized by our relationship with nature, to be changed by it. And the only way that, the only thing we can do when we are changed by it is to go beyond the personal change to more structural change as well. And I appreciate what you said about gift, because it really is when creation is gift. And I think we need to use language like that to help us connect with it, but then take that energy and translate it into a little bit of holy anger. They say holy anger is, it's holy when it's appropriate. So when is the anger appropriate, and how does it help bring about positive change that is in line with what our Creator is looking for? So I think that's especially important. I loved grumpy Pope Francis, and I actually think if he'd released it a couple months later, it would have been, he'd be furious, because look at what we've got else we're dealing with in the world right now with what's happening in the Middle East, that we can't help but name and recognize as another layer of pain and suffering that we somehow need to help us and help our brothers and sisters get out of through a third way. But yeah, I really appreciate bringing that local experience of Saskatchewan. You really brought it to mind, and I think that's the only way we can make sense of something like an apostolic exhortation, is to bring it into our spirit of place.
Thank you. I really appreciated Chris's acknowledgement of his personal relationships with the Indigenous folks that he knows, and how statements like Laudate Deum and how our conversations might be perceived and reflected by the feelings and realities of his Indigenous friends. I really appreciated hearing about that. And Genevieve, you just got me so fired up about the responsibility that we all have. We are talking to our leaders. We are asking things of our leaders, but we have to keep doing that. You called us to live into our citizenship responsibilities, while also realizing that some of the things we're calling for may cause us some discomfort. We need legislation of our own actions, our own lives. We need to legislate limits. And even though we're calling for this, we have to recognize that some of that might hurt, but it is absolutely necessary that we have to keep pushing for those, and then graciously give over the sacrifices that require to make that work. So I really appreciated that aspect of what you had to say. Okay, so we have just 15 minutes now. I'm going to ask Anna if you see any hands with questions, or if there are questions in the chat. So I'm going to take a look at the chat.
Yeah, I like that comment by Mark. That's something I tried to signal a little bit in my presentation, that the last sentence of the apostolic exhortation explains the title. And it gets into this idea that it really is hubris to take God's place and that we're behaving in that way. And that this is a mistake. And people of faith, people of monotheistic faith, should recognize that it's a huge mistake to take on the role of thinking that you have the mind of God and not thinking through these relationships and the consequences of our action. So I did suffer through my ecclesial Latin class, 6 credit hours, and I was trying to say Laudate myself, but I think probably we make that mistake just because we're thinking of the intimate connection between these two documents. And interestingly, the encyclical is supposed to be what I signaled is it's supposed to be more authoritative for Catholics. You're supposed to accept Laudato Si if you're Catholic, unless you prayerfully dissent from it, right? And I don't think that people go through and think through all the implications of what's in this document. Francis quotes himself quite a bit, and then that serves to uphold that authoritative nature in this teaching.
Thank you, Chris. I see a question from Joe Gunn. He said, he heard today that Francis is going to COP28. What can be done there realistically? So I pose that question to Chris and Genevieve and maybe myself too, but maybe Genevieve, I think if you who have feet on the ground near Ottawa, maybe you might be a good person to answer this at the moment.
Well, I'll tell you my first impression. And I did think about this week, as I said, I don't think Francis was planning to go to COP28, but I cannot help but wonder if he sees an important role for interfaith work around peace and security as part of this. I say that because COP28 has identified, I think there's like an interfaith pavilion, and I don't know as much about it, but this idea that faith groups have a role. What is still horrifying is that the lobby crew of fossil fuel companies have a significantly larger role. So this is the challenge. Do we want to cede the space to the fossil fuel companies? Do we want to just let, I'm forever forgetting the number, what it was for last year's, but hundreds of fossil fuel company executives, do we want to let them meet with our government leaders? Or are we going to take up space, even if it's perhaps not, might not be as effective as we want it to be? And then what could we do with that space to make it more effective? Is there space for interfaith work that can push us further? Because the truth of it is, too, is the Middle East, where a lot of the oil is not a Catholic area, not a Christian area. So if we're going to have a global approach, there has to be a strong dialogue. And again, we've seen with what's happening in the Middle East, specifically in Gaza Strip, the importance of dialogue and having that openness in order to get things done.
Yeah, so Francis, just on that meta level, Francis is very clear that what's been happening at these meetings is inadequate, and it's a weak politics, and it's one that doesn't take into account the true legacy of leadership that politicians are supposed to be leaving. He sees hope in Laudate Deum for what he calls heartfelt religion that I mentioned just in passing, and to have the courage of religious conviction, faith-inspired energy directed towards this problem. If most of the people in the world identify with a religious tradition, if the religious leaders take up this call in their realm of leadership, then that can also be transformative. So he hopes for a conversion on this, that this is an ultimate political interest, including for your own. He appeals to that more selfish motivation and turns for politicians' own ultimate legacy. But it's also what he's saying, what heartfelt religion has to be today to be contextual and to be relevant in the world. He's pointing towards that in here.
And I think Laudato Deum, Pope Francis is clear that, well, I'm not sure that he has a lot of hope in the outcomes that we need from the United Nations Conference of the Parties number 28. He said we've had 27 before, and we're not really that much better than we were ahead of or behind any of those other ones. but he does encourage us to make the changes that we can make in our locations. Again, putting some of the responsibility back on us to do whatever we can in our places, whether it is with our own Catholic leadership and with our own Catholic communities, or ecumenically, interfaith, or with other secular organizations that are doing this work. And in that instance, I'd like to maybe mention one or two. Eco-Justice is a group of lawyers who fight on behalf of many different ecological advocates and Indigenous peoples for policy that corrects mistakes. They are always looking for both financial support, but also moral support. And there are many organizations like those. There's also some good things happening that we could support and be part of. The federal government has a 2 billion tree program where they are funding for the next 10 years any private or public organization to put together a proposal to plant hundreds of thousands of trees. If Catholic communities bonded together and said, okay, just as an example, in this diocese, we have X number of properties, and we could put 50,000 trees on those properties with the organized support of volunteers and get behind them and allow them to do this work, then we could partner with things that the government has offered to move us forward. To me, it comes down to ways that we can still individually have an impact through our collaborations. And it's finding those effective collaborations that I think is important and that will drive real change. Are there other questions that people might have? Have you seen any, Anna? I see Andrew.
You're muted still. Yeah.
There we go.
I was just very interested in Genevieve's comment. I think it was her. Creation is a gift, and my Franciscan background leads me to say that Saint Francis talked about in Latin sine proprio, without ownership. You can use it, but you must be responsible. In other words, stewardship, not ownership. And there is this idea among Franciscans that we have a universal kinship with creation. And for us, we have to advocate. And I like what you just said, Agnes, and what Mark Norbury is involved in. This sue big oil to get money from the oil companies to help transition, a just transition away, and to pay for the damage done by the fossil fuel industry. So that's my input. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We have time for, I think, one more, if anyone has something that they'd like to either comment on in terms of what they've heard or a question.
Yeah, I just want to maybe highlight a connection between what Genevieve and Agnes were saying. So this is paragraph 38 of the exhortation, where he talks about, and related to Joe's question as well, he talks about the failures of the old multilateralism and also its successes in the Ottawa process, for example. But he discerns part of the problem, Francis is discerning part of the problem, is that this has been a multilateralism of the elites, right? And so he has this idea about a medium-term solution in a multilateralism from below, that Genevieve rendered. And that's the idea that people, maybe that Greenbelt example from Ontario recently is a good one, that people's, just outrage at things that people thought had been settled and are sliding backwards, that rises up and that causes politicians to come to account. And if it caused the Ontario government to come to account, given who they are,
Isn't there more hope for other governments who are maybe more attuned to that type of multilateralism? So that's a place where the personal and the political can connect in important and transformative ways, Francis is saying.
Fantastic. Did I see that Mark Silvestre shared a link? Or did I not see that? Okay. Any other comments or questions? Well, it's been a lively discussion, and I hope some of our conversation has sparked some fire in each of you. Through the chat box, there's a number of things to explore, and we hope that you can follow up on some of them. I'm going to take a few minutes now just to pick up again the Laudate Deum examen with a few questions that were at the end of the fifth part of it. So in the examen, it questions, how is God asking me to realize love, justice, and solidarity with all of creation tomorrow, in my day tomorrow? What policies can I support which help our culture to do the same? And how will I do so with the courage needed to produce substantial changes? Who might be involved with me on this pilgrimage? And with that, I can't help but recognize and be thankful for the support of the Laudato Si movement specifically, because worldwide, the voices that we hear and that we share helps us find ways, by the example of others and by self-examination, how we can answer these very questions. And Genevieve has also put in the chat box the campaigns from Development and Peace and the ceasefire call to action in Gaza. So I think that rounds up on time our discussion this evening. We've had close to 50 people here. It's been wonderful to have you all join us. This is recorded. I'll be doing a synopsis and a short story in my next newsletter to encapsulate what we talked about tonight, and to keep some of these campaigns alive and moving forward, because there's many options that we could work together on, but some of the ones that we've suggested here are ones local to us here in Canada. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Have a good night, and keep your ears peeled to the ground for positive, spiritual-filled actions coming out of COP28. We can pray and hope that they are there.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody.